Late January 1968, just days before the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. Deep in the jungle northeast of Saigon, Australian soldiers were patrolling unfamiliar ground. The terrain was thick, broken, and hostile, but not quiet. There were signs everywhere. Fresh tracks, recently abandoned camps, unused ammunition stacked beside foxholes. Something was coming, and then it did. The first shot shattered the stillness. Automatic fire tore through the trees. Mortars thumped in the distance. One patrol was hit, then another. Fire support bases Andersen and Harrison came under attack. But this wasn't just a local skirmish. It was the opening wave of one of the most explosive campaigns of the entire Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive had begun. And while the world's attention shifted to the battle for Saigon, Australian troops found themselves in the path of a major enemy thrust, aimed at U.S. command and logistics hubs. The Australians weren't just holding the line, they were fighting to plug a critical gap in the Allied defenses. Operation Coburg was never meant to be history-making, but as Viet Cong forces surged across the country, the men of the 1st Australian Task Force stood in their way cut off, heavily outnumbered and under fire from all sides. This is the story of how Australian troops helped stop the Tet Offensive from turning into a total collapse, and why almost no one talks about it. By early 1968, the Vietnam War was about to change. The United States had poured hundreds of thousands of troops into South Vietnam. Major bases like Bien Hoa Air Base and the massive Long Binh logistics hub just north of Saigon had become essential to the war effort. They housed aircraft, artillery, command infrastructure, fuel depots, and tens of thousands of American and ARVN personnel. But intelligence reports were troubling. There were whispers of large enemy formations massing outside Saigon. Intercepts suggested that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units were moving into position along jungle trails and hidden supply routes. Their target wasn't clear, but the threat was growing by the day. The Americans called for help. In a rare move, the Australian government authorized the 1st Australian Task Force, 1st ATF, to operate outside its usual area in Phuoc Tuy Province. It was the first time in the war that Australian forces would deploy to protect an American sector. The mission was codenamed Operation Coburg. Their orders: establish fire support bases northeast of Bien Hoa, conduct deep jungle patrols, ambush enemy forces, and deny the Viet Cong access to key approach routes into Saigon's northern flank. It was a risky deployment. The area was unfamiliar, heavily forested, and known to be crawling with VC. But the Australians accepted the mission and moved quickly. Fire support bases Andersen and Harrison were constructed under pressure, and within days, Australian patrols were in contact with enemy forces. What no one knew, not yet, was that the North Vietnamese were about to launch a massive, coordinated assault across all of South Vietnam. And Operation Coburg would place Australian troops directly in the path of one of its deadliest thrusts. While the world would remember the Tet Offensive for what happened in Hue and Saigon, it was in these jungles, far from the TV cameras, that the Australians would face some of their hardest, most critical fighting of the war. And they would do it quietly, outnumbered, outgunned, but not outmatched. On January 24, 1968, elements of the 1st Australian Task Force moved out of Phuoc Tuy Province and into the dense jungle northeast of Bien Hoa, deep inside enemy territory. It was unfamiliar ground. The Australians had spent nearly 2 years fighting Viet Cong guerrillas in their own province. But this was something else entirely. The terrain in the Coburg area of operations was tougher, wetter, and riddled with canal systems, tracks, and concealed enemy positions. It was classic Viet Cong country, and they knew it far better than the Australians did. Within days, the Australians established Fire Support Base Andersen, followed shortly by FSB Harrison. These hastily constructed bases would become the backbone of Operation Coburg. Artillery guns were dug in. Concertina wire was strung around makeshift perimeters. Observation posts were placed, and patrols began. Immediately, the signs were clear the enemy was already there. Fresh boot prints, recently used bunkers, abandoned cooking fires, small arms fire in the distance. It wasn't just an active area, it was a staging ground. Unbeknownst to the Australians, they were now operating right in the middle of a key North Vietnamese approach corridor into Long Binh and Bien Hoa. A corridor the NVA had no intention of giving up without a fight. Every patrol sent out from the fire bases found something. Signs of movement, VC runners, snipers, or direct contact. Ambushes became routine. By the third day, Australian soldiers were already taking fire from multiple directions. And yet, there was no full-scale battle. Not yet. The jungle was holding its breath. Then came the intel reports, intercepts, sudden radio traffic, suspicious quiet in enemy-held zones. Something was building, something massive. What the Australians didn't know, but were about to find out, was that they were standing in the path of the largest communist offensive of the entire war. And when it came, there would be no warning. By the final days of January, the jungle around Fire Support Base Andersen was alive with tension. Every patrol from the 1st Australian Task Force reported signs of enemy movement. Not just small units or guerrilla groups, but large organized forces moving along concealed tracks. Some patrols discovered freshly dug bunkers and ammunition caches. Others stumbled across recently vacated campfires still smoldering. The Viet Cong were close. Too close. Then the shooting started. The first major contact came when a platoon-sized patrol encountered a heavily armed VC force near a canal line east of FSB Andersen. The Australians walked into a deliberate ambush. RPGs exploded from the tree line, machine guns opened up in short, accurate bursts, and enemy snipers fired from concealed positions. The patrol returned fire immediately, using suppressive bursts and calling in artillery support from Andersen. It was a sharp, vicious engagement, and it wouldn't be the last. Throughout the following days, contacts became more frequent and more intense. Enemy forces showed a level of coordination not normally seen in smaller skirmishes. There were signs the Viet Cong were probing the fire bases, testing their defenses, measuring the response time of Australian artillery and air support. The Australians adapted fast. Patrols were reinforced with armored personnel carriers. Artillery fire was pre-planned and coordinated with movement. Sniper teams were deployed to cover vulnerable approach routes. The dense jungle was becoming a chessboard, and the Australians were determined not to be outplayed. But there was something deeper, more ominous behind it all. The enemy wasn't just defending terrain, they were preparing for something. The constant engagements weren't just harassment, they were cover, diversions, distractions. And intelligence reports filtering in from US and ARVN sources hinted at something massive moving behind enemy lines. Back at Andersen, radio operators picked up strange traffic. Forward observers reported increased movement at night. Tunnels were found, abandoned in haste. Something was about to break, and it would break on the night of January 30th, with an explosion of violence that would stretch from Saigon to Hue and right through the Australian perimeter at Coburg. The Tet Offensive had begun. By the final days of January, the jungle around Fire Support Base Andersen was alive with tension. Every patrol from the 1st Australian Task Force reported signs of enemy movement. Not just small units or guerrilla groups, but large organized forces moving along concealed tracks. Some patrols discovered freshly dug bunkers and ammunition caches. Others stumbled across recently vacated campfires still smoldering. The Viet Cong were close. Too close. Then the shooting started. The first major contact came when a platoon-sized patrol encountered a heavily armed VC force near a canal line east of FSB Andersen. The Australians walked into a deliberate ambush. RPGs exploded from the tree line. Machine guns opened up in short, accurate bursts, and enemy snipers fired from concealed positions. The patrol returned fire immediately, using suppressive bursts and calling in artillery support from Andersen. It was a sharp, vicious engagement, and it wouldn't be the last. Throughout the following days, contacts became more frequent and more intense. Enemy forces showed a level of coordination not normally seen in smaller skirmishes. There were signs the Viet Cong were probing the fire bases, testing their defenses, measuring the response time of Australian artillery and air support. The Australians adapted fast. Patrols were reinforced with armored personnel carriers. Artillery fire was pre-planned and coordinated with movement. Sniper teams were deployed to cover vulnerable approach routes. The dense jungle was becoming a chessboard, and the Australians were determined not to be outplayed. But there was something deeper, more ominous behind it all. The enemy wasn't just defending terrain, They were preparing for something. The constant engagements weren't just harassment. They were cover, diversions, distractions, and intelligence reports filtering in from U.S. and ARVN sources hinted at something massive moving behind enemy lines. Back at Andersen, radio operators picked up strange traffic. Forward observers reported increased movement at night. Tunnels were found, abandoned in haste. Something was about to break, and it would break on the night of January 30th, with an explosion of violence that would stretch from Saigon to Hue and right through the Australian perimeter at Coburg. The Tet Offensive had begun. At 3 a.m. on January 30th, the night sky lit up with flashes and thunderclaps of incoming fire. Across South Vietnam, communist forces launched a massive, coordinated assault that would come to define the war, the Tet Offensive. More than 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army troops struck over 100 towns and cities simultaneously, including Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, and crucially, Bien Hoa and Long Binh, the very installations Operation Coburg had been tasked to protect. At Fire Support Base Andersen, the Australians were already on edge from days of contact. When the mortars started falling, they were ready. Enemy rounds landed inside the perimeter. The base shook under the impact. Shrapnel tore through sandbags, vehicles, and dugouts. Australian gunners scrambled to man their 105mm artillery, returning fire in all directions. Troops ran to their posts, some still pulling on their boots. The base had been partially hardened, but not enough to prevent damage, and the enemy wasn't done. While rocket attacks slammed Andersen and nearby FSB Harrison, enemy infantry probed the wire, looking for weaknesses. These weren't random attacks. They were coordinated attempts to breach the fire bases and open corridors for Viet Cong units pushing toward Long Binh and Bien Hoa. But the Australians held. Patrols were pushed out to intercept. Infantry sections engaged in running battles through jungle clearings and along canal lines. One contact saw an entire VC assault squad wiped out by a coordinated infantry APC ambush just kilometers from the base. In another, a team of sappers was intercepted trying to emplace mines along a track used by U.S. supply convoys. The stakes were enormous. If the enemy broke through the Australian screen, they would have a direct route into Long Binh, home to thousands of U.S. troops, fuel depots, and one of the largest logistics centers in Southeast Asia. Despite being outnumbered, the Australians used superior training, jungle fighting experience, and relentless artillery support to keep the enemy at bay. Every engagement delayed, diverted, or disrupted VC operations. Coordination was key. Australian artillery batteries fired thousands of rounds in support of U.S. and ARVN units under siege elsewhere. Helicopter gunships flew low over the jungle, laying down rockets and minigun fire to halt enemy columns. And still, the Australians pushed further into enemy territory, hunting down VC formations that were trying to regroup after failed Tet attacks. The men of 1AT weren't holding the capital or defending television stations, but they were holding something just as vital, the enemy's front door. For over a week, they fought under constant threat. Fire bases were mortared almost nightly. Patrols left every morning not knowing if they'd return. Yet morale held, discipline held, and the line held. In the chaos of Tet, while cities burned and headlines screamed of collapse, the Australians in Operation Coburg stood firm. And because they did, the enemy never reached their full objective. Throughout the first week of the Tet Offensive, fire support bases Andersen and Harrison became prime targets. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong understood that these positions were more than artillery outposts. They were shields. As long as the Australians held them, enemy forces couldn't push toward Bien Hoa or Long Binh without being seen, shelled, or stopped outright. So they hit them hard. Night after night, enemy mortar teams opened fire from the jungle. Some rounds hit their mark, blowing apart defensive wire, damaging bunkers, and injuring men caught in the open. The soldiers quickly adapted, reinforcing fighting positions, setting up counter-mortar patrols, and hardening perimeters with extra sandbags, claymores, and trip flares. Every man on base, infantry, engineers, artillery, signalers, had a job to do, and every one of them knew the enemy was watching. The artillery crews worked around the clock, responding to fire missions in support of both Australian patrols and U.S. and ARVN forces engaged elsewhere in the Tet battles. Some days saw thousands of rounds fired. Every shell sent downrange disrupted enemy columns, hit supply routes, or broke up attacks before they reached populated areas. Casualties mounted, but morale remained unshaken. Medical teams treated shrapnel wounds and concussion injuries in makeshift field hospitals. Mechanics worked under fire to keep vehicles running. Signal teams coordinated with American gunships and Allied ground units. It was a full-spectrum defense, a team effort under extreme pressure. Then came the closest call. One night, enemy sappers attempted to breach FSB Harrison's wire under the cover of mortar fire. Armed with satchel charges and grenades, they slipped through gaps in the jungle and crawled toward the base. But they were spotted. Flares lit the perimeter. Machine guns opened up, and the sappers were cut down just meters from the edge. The fire bases held, not by chance, but by grit, coordination, and a refusal to yield. The enemy had hoped to knock the Australians out early in Tet. Instead, they found two fortified bastions that refused to break. By mid-February 1968, the Tet Offensive had begun to lose momentum. Across South Vietnam, Allied forces were pushing back. In Saigon, U.S. and ARVN troops had retaken major government buildings. In Hue, brutal house-to-house fighting was slowly turning in the Allies' favor. And in the jungles northeast of Bien Hoa, the Australians of Operation Coburg had done their part, and more. The enemy had been denied access to vital routes. Repeated attempts to push through to Long Binh and Bien Hoa had been intercepted, repelled, or shattered before they could gain ground. The fire bases had held. Patrols had remained aggressive, and the enemy's window of surprise had been slammed shut. With the immediate threat fading, 1 ATF began withdrawing from the Coburg area in early March. Fire support bases Andersen and Harrison were dismantled. Artillery units packed up. Infantry companies loaded into APCs and helicopters. What was left behind was a devastated landscape. Cratered jungle, destroyed bunkers, spent shell casings, and the quiet knowledge of a job completed under fire. The cost had been real. 10 Australian soldiers were killed during Operation Coburg. 52 more were wounded. The confirmed enemy dead numbered over 145, with many more believed to have been killed or wounded in unrecorded engagements deep in the jungle. But beyond the numbers, Coburg had proven something vital, that Australian troops could deploy fast, hold ground, and disrupt major enemy movements on a scale far larger than their numbers suggested. They had protected key American positions when it mattered most, and they had done it while the rest of the world focused on Saigon's burning embassies and televised chaos. The battle for Coburg was over, but its impact would echo far beyond the jungle. Operation Coburg never made the front pages. While the world watched dramatic footage from Saigon and Hue, Australian troops were fighting and winning in a dense, silent corner of the war, far from the cameras and headlines. There were no urban ruins, no embassy sieges, no political theater. Just disciplined soldiers holding a jungle line under fire, keeping pressure on the enemy when the entire front was threatening to collapse. Today, Coburg is recognized by military historians as a critical, if understated, component of the Tet Offensive response. Without the 1st Australian Task Force holding the northeast approaches, the Viet Cong might have broken through to Long Binh, the logistical lifeline of the U.S. military in South Vietnam. If that had happened, the chaos of Tet could have spiraled into an even greater disaster. For the soldiers who fought there, Coburg became one of the defining campaigns of their Vietnam service. It showcased everything the Australian Army had built since arriving in country: rapid mobility, jungle warfare skill, discipline under pressure, and seamless integration of artillery and infantry. And while it was one of the few times Australia committed troops outside its assigned province, it proved they could operate in any zone, alongside any Allied force, and deliver results that mattered. Coburg never sought recognition. It was a quiet operation in the shadow of louder battles. But for those who were there, and for those who study what could have happened if they hadn't been, it remains one of the most successful and strategically vital missions of Australia's Vietnam War. Operation Coburg was never meant to be remembered. It was a support mission, a quiet deployment into a patch of jungle no one could find on a map. But when the Tet Offensive exploded across Vietnam, the men of the 1st Australian Task Force were already in position, and they held that position against artillery, against ambushes, against the odds. They weren't in the capital. They weren't on the evening news, but they were exactly where they needed to be, and they made sure the enemy didn't get any further. These are the stories that often get lost in the shadow of history, not because they're less important, but because they were fought by soldiers who didn't ask for recognition. They just did their job, and they did it with quiet courage. If you found this video valuable, consider leaving a like, sharing it with someone who respects military history, and subscribing to the channel. It helps us bring forgotten battles like this back to light, and to the veterans of Operation Coburg and the families who carry their memory. Thank you. And to you, the viewer, thanks for watching.